we come to the Second Amendment. This is one of the really controversial ones, the hot-button issues. What this means about the Constitution, the general point, is that the Constitution is not really a document that magically has all the answers to all the hard questions society faces. It would be crazy to expect that. What it is, instead, is a framework within which we can make arguments about what the right answers are, about what fairness and equality require. These look like political arguments or moral arguments, but in fact they're constitutional. And now, let's take a look at how that process is playing out with the right to bear arms. The great debate over the Second Amendment, which the Supreme Court has recently resolved in part, has been about whether it protects an individual right or a collective right. Is it a right that individuals can invoke, or does it rest with states and their militias? Let's start at the beginning, with the amendment itself. The Second Amendment is unusual in that it tells you why it's there. It tells you what it's supposed to do. We have the Second Amendment because a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. That's why the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So this tells us what the amendment is supposed to achieve as far as federal laws are concerned. It's supposed to preserve the viability of the state militias for several reasons, but perhaps chief among them, so that the state militias can stand up, if it's necessary, and fight off the federal government. That means there is a collective purpose here. The point of the amendment is to protect state autonomy, not to help out hunters, and not even to facilitate private self-defense. But knowing the purpose doesn't actually tell us the scope of the right. It doesn't tell us whether it should be limited to arms bearing that's related to state militia service, or whether it extends beyond that. Because it's quite possible that the framers had a collective purpose in mind, but chose to promote that purpose by protecting an individual right. And indeed, this is more or less what the Supreme Court ended up saying in a bitterly contested 5-4 decision when it struck down the District of Columbia's ban in the Heller case. Heller is an example of strategic constitutional litigation, just as much as Brown v. Board of Education was. The lawyers who brought this case wanted the Supreme Court to endorse an individual rights perspective, but they still chose a plaintiff who was a member of something like a militia, a member of the D.C. police force. Dick Heller was a special officer who carried a handgun as part of his job. He wanted to keep one at home for self-defense, but D.C. wouldn't let him. And the Supreme Court said, in essence, yes, there is an individual right here. It's subject to some regulations, whose permissible scope we won't attempt to determine now, but it is an individual right related to self-defense. But what about the right to bear arms? The point of the Second Amendment, I've said, is to protect state militias against federal interference. So can the Reconstruction Congress now be trying to protect state militias against state interference? That doesn't make much sense. And, perhaps more important, would they want to protect state militias at all? The framers love state militias. They think of the Minutemen, fighting for liberty against the British Redcoats. But when the Reconstruction Congress thinks of state militias, they think of the Confederates, fighting for slavery against the United States. In the war for liberty, the state militias are on our side. In the war for equality, they aren't. And yet, if you look at the debates of the Reconstruction Congress, you'll see they did in fact talk about the right to bear arms. They did in fact want to make this a right that individuals could assert against states. So what it said is that you have an individual right against the federal government, which was given for basically a collective purpose, and the same individual right against the states, but this time for more of an individual purpose. The right is not absolute. Like all rights, it's subject to some kinds of limits and regulation. The Supreme Court hasn't figured out all the details yet. And for those of you who care about this right, on either side, that means there's still important work to be done.